This is the first in-person luncheon that we have had since 2019. I'm Executive Director Malcolm Rich. We purposely kept our number of attendees small today, but our program is being videoed and will be made available to thousands of persons by the end of the week. And you should contact us anytime you want a copy. But we appreciate all of you who are here today. Chicago Appleseed Center for Fair Courts was established 25 years ago, and with it, the Collaboration for Justice with the Chicago Council of Lawyers was born. Today, we're one of 18 Appleseed social justice centers comprising the Appleseed Network. Focusing on the courts, we leverage the unique insights and best practices of staff, volunteers, community partners, and members of the Chicago Council to interrupt cycles of poverty, mass incarceration, and racial injustice perpetrated by all aspects of the legal system. Through community-informed research, we advocate for practical, evidence-based solutions to improve the quality of justice in Cook County. The collaboration has fueled an increasingly long list of accomplishments that span topics that involve barriers to justice for tens of thousands of people of color every year. I want to go through a few. Under the guidance of Policy Director Sarah Stout and our Pretrial Justice Fellow Kareem Butler, we're bringing fairness to our pretrial legal system without sacrificing public safety. We're faced with countering $35 million worth of misinformation and outright lies from state and national political sources. But we will prevail because the fairness and the credibility of our criminal legal system is at stake. With the guidance of our Civil Court Project Director, Elizabeth Munkus, we worked with the presiding judge of the Domestic Relations Division to create a corps of administrative hearing officers who are cutting substantially the time that it is taking thousands of single parents to get their child support each year. And we helped design and launch an early resolution program in the Domestic Relations Division for those unrepresented by legal counsel. This is an attempt to restructure the courts to substitute for the lack of pro bono lawyers that sometimes are not in those courts. With the guidance of Appleseed Network Fellow Caitlin Phillip, we are seeking to have these programs replicated nationwide through our arrangements with the Appleseed centers around the country. We work to reduce toxic court costs and fees from being imposed on people most unable to afford them. And we work to increase legal representation of persons arrested and being held in police stations. Under the guidance of our communications director, Stephanie Agnew, our voteforjudges.org is visited by more than 65,000 visitors interested in being informed judicial voters. And we had an impact that was fairly substantial in the primary, where a very large number of very qualified judges were elected. Our research on what we call the hidden judiciary in administrative agency adjudication has helped lead to the creation and expansion of 30 central panel management agencies nationwide. These are dedicated to increasing the fairness and effectiveness in administrative agency hearings on topics including food benefits, Medicaid eligibility, and discrimination in housing and employment. Today, we operate with a vision of courts free from bias and led by a diverse judiciary who can grasp the most complex issues while showing respect and compassion to all who come before them. We will praise those judges and court officials who are doing the right things, and will advocate for needed changes. The people of Cook County and the state of Illinois deserve no less. In the next year, we're going to add 3 programs that will propel the collaboration for justice into the next quarter century. And I hope each of you will consider joining us as volunteers. The Future Justice Lawyers of Chicago is a project designed to create and promote a culture of systemic reform of our courts among high school students and undergraduate students. The project is being done under the guidance of Chicago Council of Lawyers and National Appleseed Board member David Schroet. Our court observation and education program is a comprehensive court watching program done as part of many of our projects, but also including observing judges who are having issues with temperament, bias, and courtroom management issues. There's virtually no chance that they will not be retained on a ballot, but we can't afford to let thousands of people be harmed. So that is why we're starting this courtroom observation program. This project is being conducted with the guidance of the Jill DuPont Memorial Fellow, Jennifer Lee. And finally, the community outreach program involves reaching out into the community to get input on issues affecting court fairness, effectiveness, and efficiency. In turn, this outreach makes us a more effective organization. And this program will be conducted with the guidance of our Director of Program Management, Naomi Johnson. Over the next year, we will focus on building the future with these projects, as well as with our work around criminal legal system reform, immigration court reform, civil court reform, and police accountability. Please help us improve lives by improving courts now and in the future, by contributing using the form in the envelope at your chair. We depend upon contributions from people who care about the fairness, effectiveness, and independence of our courts and administrative agencies. We appreciate your time, and we appreciate your money. So you can leave the envelopes on your table, you can drop them off in the collection box that's at the back of the room right before you leave. Thank you. And now I'm going to stay up here because it is my honor to present our Commitment to Justice Award to Dr. Mary Pattillo. Mary's the Harold Washington Professor of Sociology and African American Studies and Chair of the African American Studies Department at Northwestern University. She's the author of 2 award-winning books on class stratification, public housing, education, crime, urban planning, community organizing, and youth culture. She has won awards, grants, and fellowships from the Ford, Fulbright Hayes, the Fulbright, the George A. and Eliza Gardner Howard Spencer, and MacArthur Foundations. But there's a personal note here. Mary is one of the best Chicago Appleseed board members I have ever had the pleasure of working with. She played a key role in our coalition, which helped shepherd legislation which put a waiver on the toxic court costs and fees which are often imposed, too often imposed, in the criminal legal system. As executive director, I find her guidance and support to be invaluable as we employ our resources to changing a culture of a court system in need of reform. I am honored to present the Commitment to Justice Award to Dr. Mary Pattillo. My pleasure. Not so I'll get out of your way.
Thank you so much, Malcolm. It's really an honor to receive this award. First of all, it's an honor to get any award from an organization with the name Chicago in it. This is my adopted home. I'm originally from Milwaukee. I'm still a Packers fan. Hopefully you won't hold that against me. But it's really wonderful because I've made Chicago my home and the place that I've done my research for 30 years. Working with Chicago Appleseed is one way for me to help our city, our county, and our state realize our aspirations for fairness and justice. And while I know I'm supposed to be making some remarks, I really want to thank Malcolm Rich, Executive Director Malcolm Rich, for bringing me into the Chicago Appleseed orbit, for planning today's event, for growing our organization and our footprint, and for doing what I always say in board meetings, which is punching way above our weight. So join me first in thanking Malcolm. In my research and advocacy, I've worked on topics from affordable and public housing to school choice, but it's the work on monetary sanctions, or court fines, fees, assessments, that brought me into the Chicago Appleseed Network. They were the organization that brought together the task force on fines and fees for what became the Criminal and Traffic Assessment Act in 2019. This act created some standardization out of what was really a mess of fines and fees in the court system that nobody could figure out either how to assess or how to pay. But more importantly, it created waivers for low and moderate income defendants. And my research with those defendants showed how much these fines and fees kept them ensnared in the criminal legal system far beyond when their case would have run its course. Just as importantly, Chicago Appleseed has been monitoring the rollout of the Criminal Traffic and Assessment Act, where it's falling short, where it's not being enacted at all, where it's not being followed through. This follow-through is critical, as we are seeing with the current with the current Safety Act. This award is called the Commitment to Justice Award, and in the academic world, and I know also in the advocacy world, we have taken to using the term the criminal legal system instead of the criminal justice system. Chicago Appleseed, I know, works on the civil side as well, but since I am focused on the criminal side, I just wanted to say that it's so important that we recognize this shift and why we use the term criminal legal system. In my own work, 3 years of ethnography and interviews in the Illinois courts supports my hesitation in using the term criminal justice system. And for the past 3 years, I've been teaching in the Northwestern Prison Education Program at Stateville and Logan Correctional Centers, where my students have been the victims of that lack of justice. Some of my students are wrongfully convicted. Some of them are convicted for crimes way above what they might have committed. And some of them were victims of torture in Chicago. So the problem with the criminal legal system is not so much individuals, not individual police officers, prosecutors, probation officers, administrators, or judges, although individuals matter, and that vote for judges, if you haven't already filled out your, if you have a mail-in ballot, it's so easy, right at your own home. Voteforjudges.org, you just know which ones to say no to. That's the most important one, the ones that are not supported by any of the bar associations. So Chicago Appleseed is offering all of us a great service there. So it's not really about individuals, except sometimes it is, but about the institutions. The institutions have developed practices that systematically deliver less justice for and overlook illegal practices against poor people and Black people and Latinx people. It's the institutions that are simultaneously bloated and understaffed and underfunded. It's the institutions that are embroiled in political systems that have motives and incentives other than justice, namely profit or political perseverance or gain. And it is these institutions that need transformation, and in some cases, the institutions just need to go. So I am so proud to be a part of the work of Chicago Appleseed Center for Fair Courts, which is committed to justice, where we can use the word justice, and is consistently and diligently doing the work to get there. Thank you so very much for the honor, and enjoy the rest of the afternoon.
It is now my honor to present our Lifetime Achievement Award. This award this year is going to Laura Washington. Laura is a contributing columnist for the Chicago Tribune and political analyst at ABC7. She brings decades of award-winning experience as nonprofit professional and as a multimedia journalist. She specializes in African-American studies, local and national politics, race and racism, and social justice. From 1990 to 2002, she served as editor and publisher of the Great Chicago Reporter, a nationally recognized investigative monthly specializing in racial issues and urban affairs. And personally, that was the publication that I always went to when I wanted to know something really in depth about what was going on. She has been a commentator on national and Chicago public radio. She has also served as a producer for the investigative unit at CBS 2 Chicago, a correspondent for Chicago Tonight at WTTW, and previously wrote a contributing column for the Chicago Sun-Times. Laura is a founding inductee to the Medill School of Journalism Hall of Achievement. She is widely quoted and featured in the national media, including Time Magazine, the Associated Press, the New York Times, NBC Nightly News, MSNBC, PBS NewsHour, and the BBC. Today, it is our honor that she will moderate our panel on race equity and our justice system. But for right now, it is my honor to present the Lifetime Achievement Award to Laura Washington.
everyone. Thank you, Malcolm. That was really, really special. As you could tell from reading my bio, that's why I'm getting a Lifetime Achievement Award. I've been around for a lifetime. It sounds like I've done a whole lot of stuff, but it's not because I'm old. It's because I've been busy. And I really, really appreciate this honor. I mean, I look around the room and there's many old friends. I see Judd over there, and I just ran into some University of Chicago students, one of which I encountered a few years ago when I was teaching at the Institute of Politics. And of course, Mary, who I've known and worked with and learned from for decades. It's really an honor, Mary, to be up here to share this stage with you. You have such a deep set of expertise and knowledge and an incredible reputation. And as a journalist, that's very important. I talk to you very often over the years, and that's really a huge asset to me in my work, and I really deeply appreciate that. Great honor for you. And Mary was making a point about the use of words and terminology, and of course, in my business, that's a really important thing to think about. And she talked about justice, and for me, at the forefront of my career and my work over these years has always been the idea of racial equity. And racial equity is a crucial issue in our country today, but it has always been. But it hasn't always been named that way. And as Mary points out, we need to name it for what it is. And one of the things that I deeply appreciate about the Chicago Council and Appleseed is that that's the kind of work you've been doing, and you've been naming it and talking about this for decades. And I've used both organizations as a resource, sort of as a go-to source as a journalist, and as a journalist, I have to say, we're nowhere without our sources. We're nowhere without the information. We're reporters. We're people who tell the stories, but you are the stories. And so I'm deeply grateful and honored to be up here and to be part of this really important conversation. The great thing about these kinds of events is I get to learn a lot. And we're going to all learn a lot in a few minutes because we're going to have a stellar panel up on the stage. But for now, I just want to thank you for this honor. Thank you from the bottom of my heart. And I will continue to do this work alongside with you with great honor. Thank you. I'm going to first just introduce our panel very briefly because we want to leave plenty of time for the conversation. They have illustrious, stellar bios, and if you haven't seen their full bios, as I have, check them out online. But I'm just going to do a brief introduction so we can get right into the conversation, starting with Dr. Matt Epperson, who is an associate professor at the University of Chicago's Crown Family School of Social Work, Policy, and Practice. He also serves as director of the Smart Decarceration Project, and he is faculty director of the Transforming Justice Policies and Practices Program of Study. His research centers on developing, implementing, and evaluating interventions to reduce disparities in the criminal justice system. Welcome, Matt. Garien Gatewood is the director of the Illinois Justice Project, and he also serves on the board of directors of the Chicago Appleseed Center for Fair Courts. His work focuses on strategies to divert youth and adults from the legal system and provide support for people leaving incarceration. He was previously the director of policy advocacy at the Juvenile Justice Initiative, which focuses on legislation and policy reform for youth in Illinois. His career in the justice reform field began in 2014 in Ohio and Kentucky at the Children's Law Center, a nonprofit legal service center. And finally, Dr. Julian Thompson, who is an assistant professor of criminology, law, and justice at the University of Illinois at Chicago. His research focuses on, among other things, law and legal practices, punishment, mental health, inequality, and prison abolition. Dr. Thompson also directs the Urban Social Work Program for the Chicago Center for Urban Life and Culture. From 2016 to 2019, he served as an advisor on victim-related and victim-centered research and policies for the Illinois Sentencing Policy Advisory Council. Dr. Julian Thompson. So, we clearly have a stellar, very prepared, very knowledgeable group of people to talk about this topic, racial equity in the courts. Is it working? Is it not working? They're all evidence-based practitioners in the field, and they can speak very succinctly and very thoughtfully from the perspective of their research, deep research, and their experience. And it's a very timely conversation we're having because in case you haven't noticed, there's a lot of talk about justice and crime in this city, in this nation, in this state right now. And I know as a journalist, there's a narrative that I hear out there every day, especially during this election campaign, this election cycle, that crime is a big, big problem, that crime is rampant, and some of the messaging is that the only way to stop the crime is to lock more people up and to move away from decarceration programs like the ones we're going to talk about today. And we're going to dig a little bit more deeply into that messaging and what that's all about and what's wrong with it a little bit later. But first, I would like to just ask each one of you to open up by telling us a little bit more about your work and how, in particular, it relates to the racial equity in the course, starting with Dr. Epperson.
Good afternoon. Thanks so much for having me. I'm Matt Epperson, and I think I was, just quickly, I think it's important to say, like, I was introduced to this area of work because I was a practicing social worker, and I worked, took a job as a crisis mental health social worker in a large county jail in Michigan, and worked there for 6 years doing a variety of programs, which, you know, this was in the late 90s, and I think it was at a time where at least I was far less informed about this system, and I think socially we were less informed about the system, and how, you know, how problematic, how ineffective, depending on what your version of effective is, whatever it is, unless it's just purely to punish, the system is not, in most cases, effective. And I think for me, every incarceration setting I've been in, you see what ends up being, you know, tables and figures that are in other, you know, research reports or whatever that come out as statistics, but you see, you know, bullpens at Stateville full of, you know, almost overwhelmingly black and brown faces, you know, people who have faced all other kinds of injustices and disadvantages, and the system sort of collects and captures and funnels folks into those systems. So I come at it first from a practice perspective, and then in the work that I've done more as a researcher, I'm really curious about what kinds of, as you said, Laura, what kinds of messages and narratives drive the policies and programs that we see on the ground, and what kinds of messages and narratives can help to shape, you know, different kinds of responses, or at least help us to reframe the issues. So a lot of the work that I do, if you're not familiar with the sort of term decarceration, or in our phrasing, smart decarceration, it's really looking at moving away from, whenever possible, punishment incarceration-based approaches, and simultaneously looking at how to reverse the kinds of disparities that we're going to talk about, because they didn't happen by accident, and they are not going to go away by accident. They're not going to go away just because we had a good idea and didn't intentionally target it. And so much of the work I do focuses on some aspects of the criminal legal system. A lot of my work lately has been focused on prosecutors and the power that they have in the system on both a case basis and a larger, you know, case-by-case basis, and then on larger programmatic basis to really interrupt the entry of folks into that system.
My name's Julian Thompson. Thanks for having me. I really appreciate the opportunity to be here with you all. I guess I can go in many different directions with this question, but I think I'll start with the lived experience version, which is, for many people, my route to being interested in these issues really come from my upbringing and what I saw on a daily basis. If you think about, if you understand the field of research on mass incarceration, then you know that a whole generation of black and brown folks are extremely likely to interface with the criminal legal system. And just so happened, I fall into that generation. So growing up, it became sort of a normal experience to see a whole community of people being locked up, whole families, you know, people in and out the system, communities inflicted by violence and trauma, et cetera. And those really shaped the way that I experienced those things as well. Once I got older and found myself in those situations, incarcerated and then released, I had questions about my own fate, my own future, and how I was being sort of pushed in to a corner, although I had changed. So questions about access and opportunity, racial justice, things like that came from a personal standpoint, but then moved into a professional domain, which, you know, part of that was working with Matt Epperson as a doctoral student from 2012 to 2019. And the sorts of questions, I realized that my biography intersected with history, essentially. That it wasn't just about me, it was about a collective experience. And the work that I've been doing first started off with, you know, sort of decarceration courts or problem-solving courts, asking questions about, you know, the way in which race and class intersected with mental health issues and incarceration, et cetera. But now my work has moved outside of the criminal legal system and thinking more broadly about ways to sustain, build, you know, alternative institutions that, you know, in some ways make incarceration unnecessary. And, you know, I've been doing work with folks who are in the CVI space, which in some cases it can be, what I mean by CVI is community violence intervention. Work in some cases, it can be, you know, these models, they can work with police, the police force, but in many cases, the folks that I'm working with, they are trying to get us to reimagine what public safety means and what it looks like without having to rely on the criminal legal system. So a lot of the conversations around violence that often flood the media around criminal justice reform, these folks are sort of in the thick of it, right? They're in the thick of trying to mediate conflict, of trying to create resolutions on the ground in the neighborhood, et cetera, and prevent harm from being done. And so for me, it's exciting work, it's very important work, and the idea of having different public safety models in this country is a really good thing to me, so.
You know, could I just quickly follow up with you on that, on your early point about your lived experience and your experiences with incarceration, and I think you said you felt like you were pushed into a corner even though you had changed. Elaborate a little bit on that. What does that mean, or give us an example of that?
Yeah, I mean, I think from a research standpoint, everybody knows these things as collateral consequences or civil disabilities. New sort of thinking around it with scholar Jonathan Miller talks about sort of the conditions of carceral citizenship, which is a certain kind of citizenship status that is both propped up by legal policy, formal policy, and informal ways of governing people with criminal records. So you can think of all the legal barriers, bans that exclude people from working in certain jobs. At one point, the exclusions extended even to higher education, housing, et cetera. And then you got the informal things that affect your relationships, affect the trust that is between you and your community, affect romantic relationships, affect, you know, so those are the sorts of things that I'm talking about, right? Which is, at one point, this conversation wasn't happening when I got out. In 2004, the climate was very different, right? And so I was dealing with all of that and trying to figure out, is this just me or is this a system thing, right? And is it just me or is this a lot of other people who are trying to make good, but they can't? Right.
And answering that question is very important for you as an individual in your personal development, but also for us as in terms of this changing the system. Thank you very much. Garien, Gatewood.
There we go. So thank you for the question. Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Garien Gatewood. I direct the Illinois Justice Project. And to your question, Laura, about racial disparities in the system and how our work addresses them, I come to this work from a lot of different lenses, and I appreciate both what you said and what Matt said. You know, it's obvious I come to this work as a black man as we sit in these spaces, but on top of that, I come to this work from a perspective of how do we create systemic change? How do we go from system to system and find ways to make those changes. In particular, we see systems that have disproportionately impacted Black and brown folks through purposeful disinvestment. So I don't just look at the justice system alone. I look at the economic system. I look at the drivers of poverty and how poverty and poverty-related issues drive so many of the factors. And I also look at how people have been able to build prison towns and communities off the backs of Black and brown folks who have been shipped from their communities. We'll give an example. Lawndale may be shipped down to Southern Illinois and be the economic driving force for those communities for decades. When I mean decades, I mean this person has been able to put their children through school, they've been able to pay their mortgage, all while a person sat incarcerated who's not from that community. You've been the economic driving force. So we try to look at our work from a perspective of how do we make systemic changes. One route into those systemic changes is through policy, but not just creating policy. What we're finding, and I look at Sarah out here for this, what we're finding is a lot of these implementation rooms that we're in look a lot like what I would imagine some of the people in the prison towns look like, right? These implementation rooms are not filled with people of color, not filled with people who've been impacted by the system. And we have to find ways to open those doors for more people who have that experience. What we're finding a lot in reentry work, and I'm sure we'll get into this a bit more later, we've seen a lot of change in the reentry work that's happened over the last couple of years because for the first time that I can remember, people are making sure folks with lived experiences are leading those advocacy and policy conversations, not from a, we're gonna stand you up and put you out here just without any power or inclusivity. Folks really have power making decisions and are able to influence those discussions. And I often make this joke, you know, when Senator Simmons came into the Senate, one of his first bills is the hair bill. And if you know Senator Simmons, he has this great hair. I don't have it, he has great hair. It's wonderful hair. And he made
He's
a bill.
He's a state senator from the north side.
Yeah, from the north side.
And he sponsored, what is it, the Crown Act? Is that
Yes,
what it's called?
that's it, the Crown
Right.
Act, right? And he has wonderful, wonderful hair. And, you know, obviously I'm obsessed with his hair. But you're not gonna spend time arguing with him about hair. Just like you wouldn't, and it's not the equivalent, but you're not gonna spend time arguing back and forth with a person who's had lived experiences about the policies that impact reentry and why we should listen to them. So we've tried to take that approach to address racial disparities and address systemic change by having folks who have really been impacted by the system leading those discussions and trying to make sure we open doors to them where we can and how we can.
Thank you very much. A lot to unpack here, and I guess it sounds, I would guess that you would all agree that change is obviously needed. But first I'd like to back up a minute and just, I'm assuming there's some good things about the system or some ways in which the system is working, maybe ways that we can learn from or build on. So could we start with that? What's working? What's positive? What's working in the system? If you can name one thing and or maybe give us an example. You're looking kind of skeptical there, Dr. Epperson.
I'm curious about Julian's answer.
Okay, Julian, maybe he wants you to go first. Go ahead. It's on. It should be on. No.
That is a time-old question. What's working? I'm thinking of the Martinson report. What works? Honestly, from my vantage point, not much. And I mean, I guess in some places, if we're talking about Illinois, we got the promise of the Safety Act, which some may not see it as a promise, some may see it as something different. I have skepticism about it or criticism, but we'll see how it plays out in 2023.
So you feel it's imperfect or not the real answer to the solution, not a real solution? Or, I don't want to put words in your mouth.
Well, I mean, I get the idea that the bill, at least some of the arguments around that bill is that on the I don't want to falsely categorize the folks who support it, but on one side is that it addresses a racial equity question, which is it's upwards of 250,000 people are locked up pretrial a year in the state of Illinois. And the majority of those folks are racial and ethnic minorities. And the bill, at least in its form, in the way that it's intended, is to reduce that, right? By not penalizing folks and punishing them, by containing them without the possibility of being able to get out, because typically they can't afford bail anyway. So we also know that people who sit in pretrial detention are more likely to end up in prison, right, for a longer term because they end up taking a plea bargain or something. So there's that piece, which I think has promise, but then there's a other piece to it that suggests that it's not a shift. It's not that all these categories of offenses where people get arrested, that they are just automatically get released, that it's in the hands of the discretion of a judge. And that's where I think things get questionable, because the assumption on the other side is that, well, they are just going to get released, or the judges are going to use the metrics and still decide to release folks. But discretionary power just doesn't work that way.
How does it work?
I mean, from our research, we know that discretionary power can be very, dangerous. Part of like what spawned mass incarceration was critiques of discretionary power.
And is that because why? It's racist based
Yeah,
race-based
like you don't
decisions?
get rid of racial bias, but like you don't get rid of systemic racial, systemic racism through discretionary power, right? That's my hesitation. I don't, that's just my thoughts on it. But I think it's headed in a good direction. I just want to see what happens.
We worked on the Safety Act a ton, and unfortunately, the Safety Act didn't eliminate racism, right? And
Shocking.
Right? Breaking news, everybody. So I'm with you there. One of the major goals of the Pretrial Fairness Act is to eliminate so many of the people who sit in jails because they can't pay that bond. Your point about discretion is correct. We've tried to put parameters in place to have more oversight of what that discretion is, and also like bodies like Chicago Appleseed with court watching, and also keeping up that pressure to have more transparency on what's happening in there. We certainly don't think it's a one-size-fits-all solution to the problems that we've seen historically in the state of Illinois. And we know it's the first step in the direction, hopefully the right direction. There's a lot of work to be done, but I think we would all agree, similar to how you started, the system we have now ain't the answer. It's not. So that's one of the major ways to look for solutions. And then you think about what comes on the other side of that. If you don't have the Safety Act, you don't get the Reimagined Public Safety Act that puts $250 million towards gun violence prevention and other areas of violence prevention across the state, right? That opens the door for other opportunities that happen. But it is a long, long haul. I look up, and I mentioned Sarah in the last piece, but I look up because right after this, we'll go into negotiations about the Safety Act to try to get some of these things corrected. So it's a constant struggle. And especially when you're dealing with, some of the climate that we're in right now, the political climate, the election climate, it's almost like we go into a haze and forget just how traumatic election season is here in Chicago and Illinois, but you get a stark reminder around these times. And we continue to try to work on the implementation pieces. We continue to try to work on making sure the right voices are at the table, but it's gonna be a long haul. It's a lot to fix there from a perspective of the entire system. The approaches that have been taken, the gateways into the system, how folks are treated when they're in there, what protections and supports are we putting in for folks when they come home. So, that's just a part of it. We have a long way to go. And rest assured, we'll certainly be calling on your expertise as we try to work through this a bit more.
You just referred to the political environment we're in, and there are going to be negotiations going forward to, quote unquote, fix or revise aspects of the act that people are concerned about. Is that political environment, you think, going to affect or maybe in some ways change the nature of those fixes or those negotiations in maybe not so good ways, because we're such a heated political environment? There's so much pressure on the supporters of the act to fix it and make it satisfactory politically?
So I don't think we ever get to a place that's satisfactory politically, especially given the climate that we're in. I do think the political climate has a huge impact on how some of these conversations go. I think that's par for the course. You expected to have some of that. But we have not seen this level of pushback. I think Malcolm mentioned it at the top of the opening, a $35 million investment and a lot of misinformation. You know, you push back on that as much as you can, and we've been a very organized, very tactical approach to pushing back on that. But, I mean, my wife woke me up at 6 o'clock in the morning on a Sunday to talk about a message from our friends about things that they heard about the Safety Act. So my first question to her was, why are y'all texting so early, and why are you bringing me into it? But then my job was to share real information and express why there's misinformation there. And when you take a step back and you think about the crux of a lot of the misinformation, how it was spread, the approach was brilliant. You approached areas because you have to get deep into the weeds to truly understand what's happening there. And the approach was on the surface level. We'll share misinformation on the surface level, and we'll share it broadly, and we will share it to communities. Like if you, one thing that really got under my skin is when we were looking through some of the posts. I looked at one of the posts about with the misinformation on Instagram, and the hashtags were Black beauty, Black couples, natural hair, Black business, and it's like, what does any of this have to do with what we're talking about? So it's been a targeted approach to spread misinformation.
So
And
people they're using those hashtags as a way of luring people to the information.
to help spread it, right? And then at the same time, you have that approach where that's going widespread, and you have fake newspapers going around to other communities. So you're attacking, you're targeting communities on social media, and you're also approaching folks who are still at home with fake newspapers. So their approach has been very strong. Honestly, it's been a brilliant approach, right? Spread as much misinformation as you can, get people in flux. And I think that affected some of the negotiations in the beginning. You never know how these things are going to turn out until you see the final language. But people are working hard around the clock to try to get fixes in that will increase public safety for all, that stay within the original intent of the Pretrial Fairness Act.
Are you involved directly in those negotiations? Are you supporting and helping?
Yes.
Well, thank you for that work. It's important work.
Our pleasure.
Dr. Epperson, we're going to come back to you now because you were like, and I haven't heard a lot about what's working. Do you have something to share on that front?
Well, I actually would kind of reframe some of what Garien was talking about to say that kind of organized misinformation driving, fear-mongering kind of narratives, I think is a response to something that's working. And the something that's working is that there is a much more nuanced, aware narrative that's been cultivated, it's been generated in interdisciplinary settings, it's been through advocacy efforts of places like Chicago Appleseed and the coalitions that are formed to do really hard work to try to cultivate a different kind of narrative and thinking that leads to something like the passing of the Safety Act, which is a huge, piece of legislation that I don't know of one that's comparable in another state. So that is, you don't get a, I had an uncle that used to say something like, the tallest tree catches the most wind. So when you do something like that, when you do that kind of work to make major policy reform, there's going to be pushback against it. And unfortunately, it's very well funded, where I'm not sure that all these coalitions had $35 million thrown at them to, to put their ideas into action. But honestly, I was struggling to think about what's working, but I do think that's on a more macro level, but I think the system is becoming, the criminal legal system, which is really a series of, thousands of smaller systems, is becoming more permeable to scrutiny, to engagement, and whether that's because the door is being opened from the inside or pushed open from the outside, there's just much more awareness about, voting for judges or prosecutors or thinking about I got one of those fake newspapers, that
You got
that
3?
just, and I have great, students that have gone on to be part of, these efforts, and students that work, graduates that work for Appleseed and other places. So I hear, the real information, then seeing like this very thin, unsophisticated kind of narrative. But that's a calculated, it actually is successful, because that's not going to change my view. But if it's somebody who hasn't really thought about these things and they see something like it and they think, oh, wow, there is going to be some purge that's happening. Or suddenly if somebody's breaking into my house, I can't call the police because they're not going to be allowed to apprehend this person. So some of these are really false. So I think that's a really weak, what we'd call a clinical reframe, trying to take something that not so great that's happening and put something positive on it. But I do think that's part of, and it's really tedious work. The way I got to know Appleseed was I was studying a drug court, and one of the Appleseed employees was the coordinator of the court, which was a very unusual, it was here in Cook County. That was a very unusual arrangement. Most of those things are managed internally, and they keep the sort of internal logics and practices, but this individual, became like the voice of advocacy in that court system. So that wouldn't have happened, or in that court, individual court, that wouldn't have happened, 20 years ago. It would have been far less common. Sadly, that person, they no longer have that structure, so there is pushback to it. But I think there's ways that outside ideas are holding some of these policies and practices to account. But it's tedious and it takes time.
Okay, so we've talked about what's not working, but what is working, and all of you touched on some examples of what's not working. If you could you each elaborate on some aspect of your work that the biggest problem you think maybe you're facing in your work that's not working, and are there some, and if you can offer solutions, or is there a solution out there that you need more support for, or an example of something that we can take home and continue to support, with something, how to fix the problem, I guess, if it's a specific problem.
So we have seen over the last few years more and more the importance of narrative work in legal reform. I can't tell you, and I genuinely think opposition's approach to some of this narrative work has been brilliant. So if you take the Safety Act, we've talked about it a couple of times, you saw law enforcement constantly say they weren't at the table. I was sitting closer to law enforcement than I'm sitting to Dr. J right now at a physical table. But that message remained constant. And being constant in that message meant that you could say, we hadn't been at the table, this won't keep you safe. We hadn't been at the table, this won't keep you safe. And you remain repetitive in that message and organized in that message, and you were able to open more doors for different trailer bills. We've had 2 more trailer bills on the Safety Act. You also were able to open doors for more resources for law enforcement, an additional $250 million in grants. Right? This stuff doesn't happen without a organized narrative. And one thing that we have to work on in the criminal legal system is having an organized narrative. We have 35 to 70 things that we're working on a day, right? Because we always have to run and tackle these issues. What's it look like to get on the same page? And we may not agree on everything, right? But if there are 3 issues that we decide as a community we want to address, reentry and reentry supports, implementation, and resources for communities, right? If we just said, and these are 3 randomals, if we just said, but very particular, if we said we wanted to work on those issues together in unison, how do we get a more collective voice? When you think about the narrative of crime, especially during an election season, every year, every election cycle, crime comes up, which means we have to figure out what that means for our collective power in criminal legal reform, because if crime is always an issue in elections, and these are items that help people keep their seats of power, how do we use our collective power and our collective voices to move more reforms forward, to use that power and that narrative there? So we have to find ways to get on the same page in narrative work. That way it's a lot easier, I assume, I hope, to be able to move sustainable change forward, because you've seen the pushback on the Safety Act, you've seen pushback on other massive pieces of reform, but if we get a more unified voice, I think we start to see some promising things coming up. and then maybe we'll have a better answer for you next year on what's happening to work in the system.
Okay, but to follow up on that, you need a narrative, you need a better narrative, you need an alternative narrative. If you could all get on the same page, what would that alternative narrative, like in the case of the Safety Act, look like, for example?
Yeah, so the alternative narrative would be simple. The system we currently have doesn't work, because if it did, and if it was based on populations in prisons and jails, Illinois would be the safest place in the country. One of the safest places in the country, in the United States would be the safest place in the world. This system doesn't work for the people that have been impacted by it. It's made a lot of money for the folks who control it, but it does not work for the folks, the communities that have been impacted by it. Because it's not just that it's this an individual person, but you're impacting a community overall. Every time you take that black man, that black woman, that brown man, that brown woman out of those communities, you're impacting that community as a whole. So the system we've had hasn't worked. We need to see a return on investment, and we need to see better solutions. And what better solutions than the people who have been impacted by these systems leading those changes?
I think coming back to, the espoused goals of the system and what, society wants to see is really important. Like when you said safety, because it's a great way to frame it. Like, we've spent so much money and time and affected so many people, far more than any other country, but yet, you go to many other countries in the U.S., you tell somebody you're from Chicago, if you go somewhere outside of the country, and often the first thing they're going to say is like, oh, are you locked in your house all the time? Because isn't it just like a wildly unsafe place? Which, that's a different kind of narrative. But I think if we, about holding, folks to account to those ideas, so part of what I study is prosecutors, and I do think there are some promising things that some prosecutors are doing. And one of those examples is looking at issues around gun-related charges differently. So gun possession, illegal gun possession is one of, if not the most racially disparate charges in the criminal legal system. It's overwhelmingly, especially in cities, young black men, 18 to 25. And so there's some prosecutors' offices that are starting to think differently about how they process those cases and what they do with them. And in fact, some places are choosing not to move forward with prosecution, but to offer, folks a bit of an off-ramp from the system and to participate in some programming if they're on a trajectory towards violence, to try to, do some community violence intervention work to lower their risk of violence. And then if they complete the program, the charge is dismissed. Now, that's not a very politically popular program. You don't usually see that on the website of a prosecutor's office. But when I will out this one place because they're pretty open about it. It's the Minneapolis City Attorney's Office, and they started one of the earlier programs. And when we met with them, their rationale was pretty clear. They said, as a prosecutor for the city of Minneapolis, our job is to do whatever we can to help promote safety and justice in our area. And so every case that came in, we were prosecuting it to the fullest extent. And it's a gross misdemeanor in Minnesota, which means you can get, anywhere from probation to maybe 6 to 9 months in jail. So they were pushing for that, the most severe every time. And by that measure, they were succeeding. They were getting lots of convictions. But then when they looked at the data years later, many of these young men were coming back into the system after spending some time in jail with escalated charges, sometimes using a gun for violence. And so by their own goals, they weren't enacting policies and practices that were meeting their goals. What they were doing was not making their community safer. And so it actually allowed them to think, we can take some risks here because what we're doing isn't working anyway. And so we can't actually do much worse by trying to do something else. They recognize that on their own with some help from the data, but I think, them sort of learning that lesson, and that's when I work with other places that are thinking about programs like this, I come back to, well, what's your purpose when you're pushing for an incarceration sentence? What are you really trying to do? And bringing the data back, to say, oh, it's not working. It's not working. And I think that is an area where there is some promising stuff happening.
Some good news. We need some of that today. Julian Thompson.
I don't know if I'm I don't know if I'm going to bring you good news right now, so everything I have to say is pretty cynical and depressing, unfortunately. But I want to sort of share, I'm in a different direction. I'm going to share something from a research project that me and a colleague at Jane Addams College of Social Work at UIC is doing. So we're working on two projects. One of them is about how the state, and when I say the state of Illinois, the legislature, makes laws and thinks about who is a victim and who isn't, and the conditions under which they are considered a victim. That determines whether they can receive supports, protections, services, etc. And we're exploring both. We've done a deep dive over the past 50 years of all the laws that came out around victim services, rights, and protections. And we're exploring this phenomenon called, the criminalized survivor. So that's one project. We're doing interviews with families and survivors of violence, et cetera, and community stakeholders that in some ways become the street level bureaucrats that determine who is going to get services, how, under what policies they're going to leverage, et cetera.
How does that work on the street level? Explain a little bit more.
It's like, sometimes a funeral home director can make a decision about whether a family that experiences a loss, like someone who is gunned down to violence, they can make a referral or decide on how the funeral gets covered, right? Based on law, right? Police obviously make decisions too when they make determinations as to what the conditions were or what factors were at play in the commission of the violence. And if a person is implicated in that, the person who was harmed is implicated in that, they often may exclude them from eligibility. So there are all these interesting ways in which it works, right? So that's one project, and I think there's a lot of attention and traction around thinking about those things, because what that stuff does is creates a paradox of violence and safety for families and people in communities that experience high rates of violence, particularly South and West Side communities. What I'm getting at, though, is that some of the data on the other project speaks to this, which is we're doing interviews with families who have lost loved ones to gun violence, and they are going through the homicide investigation process. We've conducted 500 surveys on the west side of Chicago and interviewed homicide detectives and are now interviewing families. Something that comes out of this is the paradox, which speaks to some of what you all are talking about. We talk about safety. When we hear the term public safety, we can imagine a lot of things, but oftentimes we're thinking about better law enforcement, damping down on the violent offenders, right, et cetera. But like, what else comes to mind with safety? Just a question you ask yourself, right? How does a community experience a sense of safety? And what's coming out of these interviews is that these families, they are in situations where they don't feel safe from the police and they don't feel safe in the community. And that, what threads through that is a sense of abandonment by the city, by the state, by politicians, by any institution that has some power in creating better conditions for them, right? So they have to live with that reality, which is, this is a poor, segregated community. They don't care about black folks. The police show up. They treat us like this. Although we want better police, better protection, we can't trust them because this is how they treat us. This is how they treat our dead loved ones. And then nobody cares. So safety is a complex thing that requires us to think way beyond the criminal legal system, right? It requires us to take those fundamental causes, those social problems that are somewhat, pretty intractable, take those things very seriously to try to remedy them. And I'm getting to the point that what's not working is our definition and conception of safety.
That's pretty fundamental and pretty historically embedded. So you're still in the middle of this research, or
Yeah.
any thoughts about how to respond to that, or what kinds of policy initiatives you could implement to address that?
I got to get through the data. No, we just presented on the surveys, and the surveys are pretty interesting themselves. But yeah, hope next year.
There's always next year. There's always a lot more work to do, and we need to close this out. But I want to ask each one of you if you have a final thought about what's the most important thing that you want people to leave this room with coming out of this conversation, and what can we do? What can the folks in this room do to push that cause or that issue forward, or that solution forward?
The other thought that I had, which is not working, is the way in which we think of collaboration. So here's where I'm going with this. When we think of collaborations, collaborative efforts, 2020 was like a good moment for us to sort of like really come to awakening, at least momentarily.
You mean the George Floyd?
Yeah, exactly. Where it's like, oh, we saw like anti-racism books selling off the shelf. We saw people showing up for protests, et cetera. But then you also saw the counter pushback to all of that, right? And one thing that I noticed is that despite all of that, when historically, collaborations happen between different institutions or academics and institutions or bureaucracies or something like that. But the folks who got us here to think critically about these moments, people on the ground, organizing, activists, social movement folks, building our vision, our collective imagination, out there doing work, creating change, they haven't been invited to the table. Wow. Because of a polarizing narrative that says they are extremists, they don't care about X, Y, and Z, right? They just don't want police around. They want to create unsafe communities. All of that is just false. So I would challenge people to actually sit back, to do more research, to make space for these folks, because they have great ideas, and make that a collaborative effort.
And when you say these folks, what kinds of folks would you say here in Chicago, for example?
You got BYP 100 folks. You got We Charge Genocide, although they've been disbanded. You got, Asada Daughters. You got a bunch of folks in Chicago. You had Miriam Kaba, who was here and now in New York, who ran Project NIA, but is still involved in stuff here. So it's just a lot of different places where, are ripe for like partnerships.
And they're not being invited to the table. They're not being included.
Generally not in the policy world. Yeah. Not, they might have a media invitation, but that stops.
Got you. Thank you.
Hey, of course. How are you, Julian? When we think about that, you are absolutely correct. To that end, in 2020, my organization launched a project called Justice 2020, where our goal was to bring abolitionists, reformers, stakeholders to the table together to get that collective voice that I've been talking about. That work has been very interesting because, again, you're taking a lot of different perspectives, a lot of different approaches to the work, who we may not agree on everything. Heck, if there's 5 things, we may only agree on 2, but let's work on those 2 together. The former executive director of Asada's Daughters from my team, Christian Snow, is leading that effort. So we've tried to do a better job of making sure folks with different approaches to the work are at the table, because we don't get to those policy tables and implementation without that groundwork, that groundswell work to show the pressure, to show that this isn't right, to show here are the tables that we need to be at. And I think this is why I mentioned earlier about implementation. Those are the tables in particular, like you asked, what's one thing that folks should walk away from here? Implementation tables are where the power lies in policy discussions. You can pass the law, you can have the ticker tape parade, you can have the press conference, the high fives, all of that. the implementation tables where folks are actually deciding how these policies will work, where folks are deciding where this money will be spent, where folks are deciding how this policy will impact those communities, in particular that don't look like theirs, we have to get more folks at that table, at all of those tables. Again, this is us understanding our collective power in the advocacy space and coming together to make sure we have a seat at those tables or invalidate those tables that don't have us there. And that should be the goal. So when we walk away from here, think about two things. Like Malcolm said in the beginning, he loves money. And also, how do we get more collective power at those implementation tables, or make enough noise so they understand that we need to be at them, or they don't need to have them.
You get the final word, Matt.
Okay. If you've talked to me, I probably sound like a broken record saying this because I say this to my students, but I try to live it, which is, to me, wherever we're at with these issues around the criminal legal system, how we think about justice and safety, is to just move more towards proximity to the issues. And I take that term from Brian Stevenson, who is a real hero of mine, whose book was Just Mercy that was made into a movie, but he talks about how so many of these processes were kept from. You know, as a white person, I didn't understand, in my 20s, I didn't understand the complexities of the criminal legal system because by nature of racial disparities, I was less likely to have family members involved. And so when I got proximate, when I worked in a jail, and all of my coworkers from the mental health center were saying, I can't believe you're working in there, like, do you feel safe? And I was like, after a few weeks, I'm like, the people I'm working with are the same people that we're working with in the mental health center or in the homeless shelter or wherever, but it took the proximity to start to dissolve some of those narratives. So like for those, and so I guess I'm saying this to other folks who may not be as proximate, and there might be some of those folks in the room. So you do that by getting connected to the issues, by reading, by talking to people who have more direct experience. For those that are doing the work, I think you get proximate by making sure that folks that have a heavier stake in these issues are present at the table, which is what both Julian and Garien were talking about. I'll close with this. We did a couple conferences on decarceration, but the first one was in 2015. We had all this great planning and speakers and, spent a lot of time planning it. I think one of the most impactful things we did was at the end of the conference, we gave everybody a card that they had to really think about what they were going to do, an action that they were going to take, and we gave them some guidelines, and some of them were around proximity, making sure directly impacted people were part of their processes. And then they wrote it out, put it in a self-addressed envelope, and we mailed it to them a couple months later so that we didn't want them to lose it in their program materials. And we heard folks say, I heard somebody from Sentencing Policy Advisory Council in Illinois said, we made a commitment to make sure that we have directly impacted folks as part of our board, as part of our planning processes. Somebody was there from National Institutes of Health and said, we're gonna make it part of our review processes. So in other words, we're trying to say, how can you keep those processes from being so distant and uninfluenced by the lived realities of what your money, your policies, your advocacy is actually doing? So, and we all can become more proximate, whatever that is. So that would be my marching orders.
Great marching orders, great wisdom, lots of challenges ahead, but thanks for all your great conversation and comments today, and thanks for the great work you're doing, and we're going to continue to charge, all of us. Thank you.
Just a minute of closing. I just want to congratulate Dr. Mary Pattillo and Laura Washington on their awards. I want to thank the panelists for giving us things to think about and things to act upon. And on behalf of the Collaboration for Justice of the Chicago Council of Lawyers and Chicago Appleseed Center for Fair Courts, I just want to thank each and every one of you for coming today. We appreciate you. Thank you.